Well, welcome everyone to our inaugural event. This is something that we've been talking about at 11.2 for a little while, and it's finally great to see it up and running. My name's Mark Ogden, I'm the managing partner of 11.2, and I'll just be facilitating the festivities this evening. Look, the intention that we had for creating this series was really to bring a group of like-minded people together and really create this community of entrepreneurial innovation thinkers, bringing a group of people who wanting to do interesting things on interesting projects. It's been something that we've been talking about for a little while now, and really pleased to have this in place in conjunction with Stone and Chalk and with Lot 14. So without further ado, I'll just hand over to the two gentlemen who are going to have a casual fireside chat. My colleague and co-founder of 11.2. I'd also like to introduce Rory. So I've got to know Rory for the last few years actually, and the more I get to know him, the more I like him. He's one of the more forward-thinking innovators in this space. And CODAN is one of those organisations that is 45 minutes down the road. So this, in Adelaide terms, that's out of sight, out of mind. But as an organisation, has added over $2 billion in market cap in the last 12 months. So, doing some amazing things. So the opportunity to hear from him today. And one of the things that I first remember Rory suggested was when we were talking about innovation cultures and his view about Australia and why do we have this obsession if we're in South Australia thinking about Victoria and New South Wales. When he was in the UK and they looked at Australia, they just saw Australia. So without further ado, George and Rory.
Thanks, Mark. Now, Rory, you're going to give us a bit of an overview about CODAN first.
Sure.
Far more interesting than us.
Yeah, okay. So there's no doubt CODAN, I think, does fly under the radar somewhat. Probably because we export about 85% of what we sell. But we are a South Australian company formed about 60 years ago with literally 3 engineering mates out of Adelaide Uni. So the core of the business grew up as a communications company, particularly HF radio. And some of the early programs were school over-the-air programs in the outback and Royal Flying Doctors. So very much a heritage business in terms of communications, but probably the recent history has been dominated by some acquisitions we made just over 10 years ago. We went on a worldwide search for acquisitions and we couldn't find anything, so we bought something here in Adelaide. And it was a business, a mine lab business, a metal detection business. When I was looking at CODAN, I was living in the UK at the time, I was looking at CODAN and looking at the mine lab business, and I just had the same mental image everybody else does. This granddad down the beach with a metal detector going beep, beep, beep. And how exciting can that be? And what amazed me as I got to know it a bit better is just the amount of technology that's in those machines is just crazy. And actually what they're trying to do in terms of differentiating metal at depth, which is typically in mineralized soil. So you're getting feedback from the whole soil volume, and you've got to try and determine, even down to a grain of, like a grain of rice in terms of the size of the gold nuggets, as opposed to really, really big ones. So the amount of technology is just amazing. And I just view that system as a radio. It's just, it's electromagnetics. It's all the same kind of physics and a lot of post-processing. So there's no doubt over the last number of years, and the mine lab business has been very successful and fueled a lot of our growth. So yes, Mark said we've kind of jumped on a lot of people's radar with probably adding about 2 billion market cap in the last probably 12 months. I think the reason for that is a bit strange. I think we were formally brought into the ASX 200 during that last 12 months. I think there was a lot of pent-up demand, and there's very little, relatively low liquidity in our stock. That was one of the reasons why the ASX was slow to bring us into the two. But that just has massively increased demand for our shares, which is great. And it's on the back of what is now kind of 6 years in a row of really, really solid, extremely good organic growth year on year, and having a proven track record of delivering into a wide range of businesses. So just to kind of finish that little introduction, I'll hand back to George. It was kind of when I joined the business, Donald McGurk, my boss, the CEO, I met him in England, started talking about a role. He offered me a job. And then he came back 4 weeks later and said, no, I've got to withdraw the offer. We've just had, our world has collapsed. We've just had our main metal detector product counterfeited by the Chinese, and our profit has fallen by 90% in one financial year. So it was like the business at complete rock bottom.
What year was that?
That was 2013. And so CODAN went into a little bit of a huddle, obviously trying to figure out how to respond. And Donald phoned me up about October, about 4 months later, and said, yeah, we've done a lot of thinking in the last few months, and I've figured out that I can't afford you at this time, but I can't afford not to employ you. So we're going to do it anyway. And I ended up joining kind of March of the following year. But it was really that event which, it's interesting kind of how it tailored us as an organization. It means we take cybersecurity really, really, really seriously, because we spent about 2 years thinking that we'd been hacked. Now, actually, we now know for a fact we weren't hacked. This was good old-fashioned somebody going into a shop, buying one of our detectors, taking it back to China and reverse engineering in good old-fashioned ways. And boy, the Chinese are good at that. So yeah, we really value our cybersecurity. We really value IP, and we see a really material link between high IP, highly differentiated products, and high NPAT percentage. And frankly, I've worked in a lot of great companies in my career, and none of those companies are as profitable in terms of net profit after tax to sales as CODAN. Hands down, and by some significant percentage point. So that gives us a good segue and a good strong balance sheet to be able to go forward. Before we talk about the forward, or maybe...
Just to say, so what was the share price at the bottom after that counterfeiting exercise?
54 cents.
And what was the share price? I think it got to $19 this week.
It's 18.5, 18.35 last time I looked, today or yesterday.
So now the challenge is to go from $19 to hundreds.
And absolutely, if we think about the shareholders that are coming on now as part of the ASX, a lot of these people came in and they're buying CODAN stock at $14, $15, $16. They need a story for what's going to take us to $30, $45, $60. And that's where this whole effort is rooted.
Which, when you get to that point, CODAN will be probably the largest company in South Australia. So I think it's currently the 5th largest company in South Australia. And I think before I give a bit of context...
And can I just jump in there? Because one of the reasons I joined CODAN, and it remains a big reason why I joined CODAN, is it's a small company. We're having a very good year. We were $350 million revenue last year. We'll be something in potentially the mid-4s this year. We are a small company. I've worked for big companies. They're like $50 and $100 billion. We are not a big company. Our headcount, we've just made 2 acquisitions, so we've increased the size of the business by about 50%. Before those acquisitions, we were about 450 people. We're now about 750, 800. With an interesting footprint around the world. and those acquisitions are interesting because we now employ more people outside of Australia than in.
Great story of economic growth and innovation and entrepreneurship in South Australia, though. Just a quick, who knew of CODAN before coming today? Less than half of the people here. I was in a similar situation. I knew of CODAN, but didn't really understand what CODAN was when I moved back to Adelaide in 2018 and before we started working with you. But just to give a bit
You should have brought chairs.
I should, yeah, well, I did have lunch with one of your directors on the 13th of March last year, and the share price was $4. And I do remember thinking that I should have bought shares that day. But COVID was, in the midst of its, rampaging early days, and we thought that I'm not sure what's going on. But to give a bit of context about myself, 11.2, and how we come to be sitting here, I am an entrepreneur sort of in the DNA in so many ways. I can't help but get involved in trying to solve interesting problems and build businesses. I went to uni just there, a chemical engineering degree, never worked a day as an engineer, did all sorts of different things until about 2006 when I invested in a travel tech company when I was in Sydney, which was a Danish business, which really, my love for technology and entrepreneurship was born then. We worked with these Danish guys building a company called Contigo that built travel tech to help track travellers around the world before mobile phones could track you. It was based on itinerary data, and we built and sold that. And in 2012, after selling that, I started a company called Boodle, which we raised lots of cash from really high-profile investors and spent 5 years trying to solve a problem that in the end we couldn't solve, and we stopped and liquidated that. So between one which was mildly successful and one which was unsuccessful, we learned so much. I learned so much. And my other partner, who's not here today, Raj, who's based in Sydney, him and I worked on Boodle together for 5 years. And then when we stopped that, we just started thinking about what we could do next. And the brand 11.2 was born then. Does anyone who doesn't already know what 11.2 stands for, know what 11.2 stands for? No. 11.2 is the escape velocity in kilometres per second to get something into orbit. So we started thinking about what could we do with all the experience we had, and we started just working with companies that we knew, so people we'd known, helping them with ideas and understanding how to tackle problems. And then I came back to Adelaide and I met Mark, and he was sensible, because I'm definitely not sensible. And he was like, I think we could turn what you think into something. And I'm like, oh, that sounds like fun. Let's do that. So Mark and I started talking about this model that we thought where we could bring real entrepreneurial startup founder mindset for how you think about, find ideas and test them, and collide it with big companies to help them find ideas they would otherwise not find and test them well. And there just seemed to be something in that. And thankfully, Mark had some good friends in Adelaide, one of them being Donald McGurk. And I remember we sat down at a coffee shop and Donald said he believed in fairies at the end of the garden. I was like, oh, we've got a chance here. Someone might actually back us.
He did also say, and I'm sure you'll remember this, that if you can't figure out a way to work with CODAN, then you should close your business and do something else.
He did say that. So, we started thinking about how we would work with you guys, and, really grateful that CODAN were like, there might be something in your guys' brains around how this could work. And we started talking to CODAN and working with them, and in a real startup entrepreneur mindset, we just started talking to them and exploring and sort of colliding our thinking with CODAN and what they needed to see if there was a model that merged entrepreneurial thinking with a big organisation to solve their problems. And I remember Mark and Donald saying, oh, look, we need to find a way to 10x the share price. It was $1 billion then. The value of the company was $1 billion, not 3.5. So it's a lot harder now to do what we set out to do in the beginning. And over a long period of time, we sort of started to evolve a model for how we thought we could use entrepreneurial mindset to innovate on behalf of large organisations.
And I might just jump in and set a bit of context from the CODAN perspective. So, and I think perspective is the right word. So let's go back to CODAN. It's a large South Australian company. I'm only here because it's a small company. So it really depends on your perspective. And inside CODAN, we spend a lot of time on product development, a lot of time in that space, in that IP space, looking at differentiated products. And there's a theme and a culture around innovation within CODAN. And that kind of always strikes me as being interesting, because are we really?
Well, I'd say...
I keep challenging the guys inside about what constitutes innovation, what constitutes agility and agile. And I remember after a bit of the engagement, we were trying to figure out how we could work together. I asked Mark and George to draw me a picture. Okay, you've got to know CODAN. Draw me a picture of what you see. And they drew a bloody castle with a moat around it, because we had such perimeter security around cyber, and it was a lock and vault of high IP and high value. And I just thought, yeah, that's great, but it doesn't smack of agility and speed. We're a bloody castle. So part of what I was trying to do as part of my role was to look at the next 10 years of technology. What should we be working on? How do we build on our core competencies? How do we prevent ourselves from getting disrupted in all of our markets? And the challenge that Donald gave me was, yeah, but the last thing we want to do is get a bunch of smart engineers, stick them in a dark room, and have them solve interesting problems, because we'll never make any bloody money. And that absolutely is right. And that's so why we started thinking about, okay, how do we drive market validation? How do we pivot, and how do we, CODAN, the castle, become a lot more agile in our thinking and in our behaviors, and hence the 11.2 relationship.
So now we're in this situation where we're trying to be startup founder mindset people working with a large organisation. And I think one of the really interesting principles that we rest on, I think, in trying to collide that way of thinking with a big organisation, is to never waver from the principles of two founders in a garage and how they tackle a problem, right? And it's like, if you're two founders in a garage tackling a problem, time and money is the most scarce resource, right? Like literally, you are continuously in your head going, is it worth persevering? Do I need to pivot? Is it worth persevering? You're talking to people, you're validating, you're understanding the market. You never really stop doing that. And through that, you become really, really sort of focused on the value of that time and that money, to whether or not it's worth persisting, taking this idea further or adjusting it. And that's so different to what large organizations end up doing. Like, they are literally opposites of the spectrum. The castle, large engine, we need a business that does 50 million in revenue. Well, this is just a little idea over here on the side. So, we've been sort of thinking through this model through this real principle of maintaining what it is, what's the DNA of two founders in a garage tackling a problem with and we like to use the expression, your parents-in-law's money. So, if we're going to tackle an idea on behalf of CODAN, the filter we put on it is we'll only do it if we would do that idea with our parents-in-law's money, because that means you've been really sensible about how you take that. So, and through that, I think we're now starting to build a sort of a codification of some of that thinking that allows us to go and think about the assets and strategy that CODAN has, look at the market out there, start talking to people, and start to identify problems where there could be an idea that we could go and test, either theoretically test it or actually practically test it by building something, and see if it will solve that problem. And then if it does, well, CODAN now has an idea that's validated that they can choose to do something with. That could be venture it, it could be internalize it could be turned into a product, could be sit on it and do nothing. But, at least you now have optionality over a sort of a funnel of ideas. So I think, that's actually taken us almost a year and a half of sort of talking, resolving, speaking to the customer to resolve that model. And we've been fortunate to be able to work with the RAA in parallel. And whilst very different organisations, very similar challenge for how you, bring an entrepreneurial mindset into existence with a large organisation.
And there's an element of risk and uncertainty because you're willingly going into something and recognizing that you don't know what the output's going to be. And that's okay.
Is it?
It's okay for some people some of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. And so there's a level of kind of trust and journey. You just kind of go with the flow and see where you end up.
I think it's one of the interesting observations is that when you start solving a problem, you don't actually know if that's the idea that you're going to continue to persist with. And that's really hard for big organizations and government. Like we're talking to some government about some of the problems. It's like, I want to buy something that I know is going to work. But to work out what's going to work, we need to start something. But we can't start something until we know what we're going to buy. So you get into this cycle often where, with executive teams in government, it's quite difficult for them to have an appreciation of how to buy something like we're offering. And I think one of the other things I sort of reflect on is when we're thinking about the thesis for 11.2 and understanding like where we fit into the world. There's a lot of models that have been tried for innovation for big organizations, accelerators, venture-backed, internal innovation labs, internal innovation capabilities. I don't think any of them have been runaway successes. And I have no idea whether it's definitely not a perfect model, but a better model, but it's another model. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do is say, well, out of an innovation budget, this is a different way of trying to find ideas you might otherwise not have thought of and test them to see whether or not they're something that's worthwhile to your future as an organization.
And from CODAN's perspective and one of the things I champion internally, if we only ever invest in ourselves, we will only ever be a bigger version of ourselves. And we have the same strategic weaknesses that we have today and we had 3 years ago and 6 years ago when we were counterfeited. Now we're a lot better about protecting our IP and we're a lot better about shutting down counterfeiters than we were then at that point. But my whole thesis for this is to explore new areas. It's not to do more of what Minelab Metal Detection is doing, because guess what? They're the best ones at doing it anyway. So if that's what we want to do, we keep doing that. But the numbers will have changed, but it's probably nearer $40 million that we invest in engineering and product development each year. And my argument is I want to take about 10% of that and look at technologies and explore areas that are new and might result in something different. The challenge absolutely is we don't quite know where that end game is, but if CODAN does it, the way we'll approach it is we'll have an idea, we'll recruit a team of 20 people, we'll define a program plan over 3.5 years, and we'll take a product and design, develop, qualify, and it will be a really well-engineered product. And at that point, we'll find out if anybody buys it or not. Probably not the right thing to do. So I'm also conscious of one of my I think he was my first proper boss. And they didn't know what to do with me when they employed me, so they stuck me out the back. I was testing some stuff for the A3XX at the time, so what became A380. And it was a rudder actuator test, and the thing went unstable, and it basically nearly pulled the foundations down on the house. But anyway, it failed. And I went back to Phil and I said, really sorry we failed the test. And he said, oh, great. I said, what do you mean great? He says, well, if we'd have passed, we'd have learned nothing. It's only worthwhile doing a test if you fail it, because then you'll learn. And that's a little bit, that model applies into this entrepreneurial mode. You have to kind of almost, figure out.
Are you outsourcing failure to us?
Outsourcing failure, there we go.
So I think one of the other things that I've thought a lot about in the last couple of years when thinking this through is the fact that there are lots of great ideas that don't deserve to be companies. And I think, as you move forward, like, if we don't find these great ideas that solve real problems, and our word, 11.2 is about worthwhile problems, and worthwhile means it solves a real problem and it's good for the world. So there are two filters we put on what we focus on at 11.2. But some ideas do not belong as a venture, right? But the current structure in many ways about how innovation is tackled drives towards ventures, right? Because that's the sort of capital life cycle model, is that have an idea, founder has an idea, backs it, and it should be a venture. That means I think we miss lots of great things that really actually belong inside existing large organisations, because they've got the assets and the strategy and the capability to do something about it in an economic model that doesn't mean they need to be a venture. And I think for me, if we can get really, really good, and I've put my, spent some time on the Entrepreneurship Advisory Board hat on, if we get really good in South Australia at our big company, and we've got more big companies than most people realise, like sort of a lot of them hiding under them. If we can get really good at finding ideas and validating them so that the existing organisations or startups can exploit them to go and build and test these and turn them into ventures themselves because it makes sense to them to do so, we will get great economic growth. And I think that's where the role that Stone and Chalk is playing is really important. So I asked you, what did you know of Lot 14 and Stone and Chalk 2 years ago compared to what you know now?
Yeah, I knew of it. It gets relatively good press in South Australia, so it was well advertised. I didn't quite understand, or I certainly didn't understand what was on the inside, and even how to tap into it, to be quite honest, and whether I should. It was just something that was there, and I suppose I hadn't articulated to myself the problem I was trying to solve then, but it was definitely there in terms of how do we invest in emerging technologies in a way that it's not just what we can do, but it's what we should do. And there's a lot of things CODAN can do. We have access to a lot of technologies. There's a whole raft of things we can do, but maybe there's only 2 or 3% of those things actually we should do in order to be a success. Because certainly we can go and spend the money without a shadow of a doubt, but we quite like our NPAT. So,
do you think South Australian startups should be coming and talking to you more often?
It's an interesting dichotomy, because it doesn't matter what size you are, because we've just had a long-term relationship with Caterpillar as an example, and it's an interesting mix about how different sized players who move at different cycles with a different half-life, how those companies interact. So it doesn't really matter what size you are, but I think having an ability to collaborate up and down the spectrum is really important, because we all do get kind of into the inner cycle of this is how we do it here, and we're running at this pace, and there is so much outside of our individual walls that we just don't experience. So one of the value adds from working with these guys was just having access to that much more diverse network. You basically don't know what you don't know until you go out and have a mechanism and a way to explore and touch and feel. And so it was getting that entrepreneurial mindset, and getting access to people with different skill sets who've made different mistakes. And again, it comes back to don't waste a good failure.
So what do you think do you think the way we're thinking about entrepreneurial collaborative innovation with organisations like CODAN makes sense? And where would you think that what we're doing is different and why it's valuable compared to what you've thought about in the past?
All the organisations I've previously worked for, and I'll mention one because they're synonymous with innovation, is Mclaren. And the answer is always you do it yourself. That's the normal answer, because that's the safe space. And in Mclaren, it was privately held by very high net worth individuals. You could go to the board, ask them for £100 million to do X, and they'll give it to you. I mean, frankly, they started the Mclaren automotive business before telling the board. And Martin Whitmarsh used to kind of laugh and joke with me that he'd spent £50 million before he'd even asked permission to do anything. And he spent an hour presenting to the board and said basically he wanted to take 360 million pounds of their money, invested in this company, and they was going to build a company that was going to be worth over 2 billion pounds. And Sheikh Mohammed's response to him after his hour-long pitch was, "How's Lewis going to go at the weekend?" I don't care about money. I'm just here for the race cars kind of thing. So that is the normal mindset, is in a safe space because it's kind of what we know and it's who we know. But you very, very much get wrapped into an inside and a closed mindset. And so what the massive benefit to CODAN for this, if you like, experiment, is it kind of exposes us to a bunch of different mindsets and different possibilities and different mistakes because, it's an old expression, but it's true. I mean, no one's as smart as everyone, and the more thought processes we can get into the room, the better. And it's why rooms like this are interesting because you're getting a whole bunch of different thoughts and perspectives on the same problem.
And I think that's a good segue. It is a fireside chat, so it's an opportunity for people to ask questions. And we could keep talking about how wonderful we are for a long time, but I'm far more interested to understand perspectives from the room and what value we can add to those perspectives. So has anyone got a question? Yes.
Very, very interesting conversation. I am familiar with CODAN. Just wondering, as somebody who works in cybersecurity out of this building, back in 2013, it was pretty immature. So when you got that shock from China, how did you go about sort of future-proofing yourself to be cyber resilient?
Yep, very good question. And it wasn't one that we answered quickly. So we spent a number of years, first of all, figuring out how we'd been copied and as I say, confirmed that it wasn't a cyber incident. It was good old-fashioned reverse engineering. But then we had to do two things. We had to stop the flow of counterfeit items because that was killing us in the marketplace. And we had to build and release our next set of products. And we had to somehow do that in a way that they weren't going to be counterfeited in the future. And that was an interesting dichotomy. And I actually, at the time when I joined CODAN, I was still living up in the UK. I was kind of commuting up and down here for a couple of years before we finally moved down with my family. And one of the flights home, I flown into Heathrow in a taxi on the way home, going home, and it was just a copy of Financial Times in the back chair. So I was just flicking through this Financial Times, and there was an advert on the back about IP protection, and it was a law firm. And there was Jeremy Herzog, who was a partner on IP protection with Mishcon Del Rey, I think. So I just phoned this guy up and said, "We've got an IP problem." He says, "Oh, yes, you do. I know exactly how to solve this." So what later became known as the Holy Trinity, we put together a workshop with the legal guy in terms of how you go about prosecuting people. There was an ex-British Metropolitan Police who turned private investigator. He'd spent 20 years in undercover operations investigating football hooligans and drug trafficking and God knows what. And there was the brand protection manager for Hewlett Packard. And it's like, well, why the HP guy? Until you ask yourself, and bearing in mind this was 6 years ago or whatever, what's the most valuable liquid on the planet? Ready? Ink cartridges. Counterfeiting cost HP at that time $600 million a year, US, so $1 billion. So they were quite attuned to brand protection. So we basically had a 3-day conference in London where we had the legal perspective, the investigative perspective, and just the brand management corporate perspective. And out of that, built a strategy to go and attack the counterfeiters in China, because that needed to be stopped. And then on a similar vein, or in a different vein, is, okay, how are we going to future-proof our products so when we release the next one, they don't just pick that up and copy it. And that one's the really hard problem. And the short answer is there is no silver bullet. It's layers and layers and layers of different types of protection. So one, as an example, we're all thinking about IP, thinking about protecting IP, and we naturally think about patents. It's really difficult to protect yourself unless you're going to go and sue BHP for third-party IP infringement. It's really, really difficult to use that as how you protect your own IP. In China, Did we go after these guys for patent infringements? No. It was trademark infringements. So in our old design, we'd have a product that would come out of the factory, and virtually the last thing we do is stick a MindLab sticker on it, and then away we go. These guys knew that. They were manufacturing a unit in China, shipping it to Dubai, and at the last second before the sale, it would get a sticker on. So you can't even arrest the guy with unbranded metal detectors. So in our future designs, we go to a different material. We're embossing our names on the product, so there's a touch and feel to it. That's just one element. I mean, in the extreme, we've got encrypted firmware that is physically podded. We have air-gapped rooms in Mawson Lakes where we inject the software, and that's not connected to our network, let alone the outside world. And there's only 2 people that are allowed in that room. And there's, that's kind of 2 extremes. There's probably about, a dozen different ways that we're just making it increasingly more difficult for the counterfeiters to counterfeit our products. And now, 6 years later, we've released, I'd say, in that time, probably 10 metal detectors to the market, 4 metal detectors in the space where we were counterfeited, and we haven't seen evidence of one counterfeit product. Because I think we've made it really hard to counterfeit us, but also we've gone out after the people in China that have been counterfeiting us. So all you can do is make yourself the most difficult and awkward person to counterfeit. You can never stamp it out completely.
Any more questions? I'll come at that.
Hi, this being a startup sort of environment, when do you advise businesses to focus on cybersecurity as well as trademark and patent IP protection?
What I would say from a CODAN perspective, and particularly when we are growing at the rate we are, a lot of new people coming in, obviously we've acquired a lot of new people as well in the recent acquisitions. From day one, the most important thing is not spending money on cybersecurity, is a culture of cybersecurity.
Yeah.
If you take that seriously, and I can't swear on this, I probably can. It's a pain in the ass. But phishing is a pain in the ass, but that's the number 1 metric to get your credentials. The number 1 metric. And you've got to be resilient on a daily basis of thinking about, and particularly with smartphones, because you don't get the same level of protection. On an email, you can kind of hover over a link and see where it is. You can't do that on a smartphone. I won't click a link on a smartphone. It's not that important. I'll get to it tomorrow.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. You've got to be thinking about it and embedding it into the way you think from day one, and then investing in it appropriately, because you don't want it to cripple your early validation activities. But I think, the moment you've got someone's data or you've got someone as a customer, you've got to meet a sort of minimum level of cyber.
And just to answer the second part of your question, the IP bit is interesting for a startup because, I said we didn't protect our IP through patents, but it's in some respects for a startup, it's an important way to demonstrate the level of IP and the value of the IP in the business. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Personally, I find the patent process extremely frustrating and very expensive. And in our experience, hasn't proven to add a lot of value. Now, having said that, I'm not trying to sell the business as an IP-based castle with lots of IP valued and lots of patents in it. So it depends on the value proposition, but I'm increasingly absolutely happy to talk to companies and startups, or whether they're at Series A, Series B, and they're talking to me about trade secrets and know-how. I need to validate why you think that's really, really good. But I'm more than happy to have that conversation in the absence of the other problem with patents. It's not here's my 3 or 4 patents. It's kind of got to be here's my 74 patents in this space, and here's another 47 over here. And it's all about a portfolio. And again, that's just cumbersome and expensive and hard to manage and all the rest of it. But again, it depends on what you envisage your exit strategy.
Well, the other lens on patents is it does disclose your ideas,
Yep.
and if you can't defend them, they're not really worth very much. So, it can be very difficult and expensive to defend a patent. So, there's no right answer. I think it's really nuanced on the type of business that you are building and the technology or IP that you've got.
Yeah.
Rory, you've got a room full of entrepreneurs here. Talk to us about some of the areas that CODAN is interested in collaborating or surfacing up to the startup community. And also, for a lot of people in the room, they're probably thinking metal detector, pretty antiquated, old industry, probably didn't actually comprehend a lot of the technology that I'm sure goes into the devices. But what's the product roadmap 10, 20 years time beyond metal detectors?
So in metal detection, there is absolutely no doubt we are the market leader. It's largely driven from technology. It's a difficult market to measure, but we're pretty confident we're somewhere between 75 and 80% market share in what is a very niche market. So that roadmap is most of that is about making the UI as simple as possible. So there's a lot of automation technologies going into metal detectors, even some augmented reality, anything that makes it easier to detect out in the middle of the field. If you go back even 5 or 6 years ago, you had to be a real expert looking at understanding what the soil and the composition was, looking at what kind of gold you were looking for, looking at whether it was superfine gold, medium-sized gold, large gold, what depth it was at, and you'd fine-tune a load of variables to try and maximize the performance. What we're trying to do now with all those complex features is do what the camera industry did 50 years ago. I half press and it autofocuses. And yes, there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes, but actually that's the kind of user experience we're moving towards. And it's all about, the other piece is it's very difficult when you're out in the bush and you're detecting in an area that might be half a square kilometer. When you've spent 3 or 4 hours in the hot sun doing that, how do you know what area you've covered? Well, the answer is you don't. So how do we help the detectorists with positioning technology understand where that head has been and where it hasn't been, so they can then look at that area that they've notionally analyzed and actually go back and fill in the blanks. So a lot of that product roadmap is very much on is evolutions of the current technology. The comm side is changing a lot. So particularly with the recent acquisitions we made. So the first acquisition that was announced was for Domo Tactical Comms in the UK and the US. They are absolutely a leading provider of what's called MIMO mesh radios. So multi-input, multi-output, very high bandwidth. A lot of that is for kind of battlefield solutions, transmitting particularly video to and from soldiers and then backhauling it. So we've now got a portfolio of HF, VHF, UHF, MIMO mesh tactical radios, and the trends in that space. The whole value proposition of communications has changed. And it happened about 7 or 8 years ago, and the ramifications are still being felt. We all used to buy a phone so we could phone our mom on the way home and pick up a bottle of milk. No one cares about voice anymore. The whole value proposition of communications is about data, and it's all about what you do with data. So for a company like CODAN, that's been a comms company for 60 years, that's a really seismic change, and it's one we're still kind of getting our head around. It also means there's a software layer on the top of these products that never existed before and didn't exist 5 or 6 years ago. And that, again, that interoperability piece is really driving that through a software layer. Whereas previously someone would get a HF radio because they knew they had a requirement for long-range comms. Now it's like, I just want to use the cheapest form of communication. I don't care. My kids, they don't care for Wi-Fi, 4G, whatever, as long as they're connected. So I think there's the interoperability piece is huge in comms, the data space is huge, and video is huge. I'll flip over to the other acquisition, Zetron. That's a command and control center. So in North America and in Canada, we provide a land mobile radio, private radio network. That's the police and fire and ambulance private network, push-to-talk radio. Again, push-to-talk radio, a voice-based product. We were looking at a situation where we bought that company about 10 years ago. We'd spent most of the 10 years investing in the P25 radio systems, and we're now looking at it to think, well, why the hell did we do that? Now we have a digital voice-based communication protocol. In the data world, great. We need a data strategy for that market, which is why we bought Zetron, which is a command and control center They're the bit between the public reporting a crime or a hospital incident and actually then dispatching out to the first responders. It's interesting now when we look at the public safety answering points, as they're called, that influx of data. How do people used to on the rotary dial 000 or 911 or 999 and you phone emergency response? People don't do that anymore. It's you get a Twitter feed, you get an SMS, you get a video clip. Here's somebody shooting up the campus, and even worse than that, you might get 24 clips of the same event. So now when you're that first responder trying to triage, you've got to figure out if you've got 24 events or 24 instances of the same one. And so a lot of the technologies that are driving in that space is again about video and video analytics. So what does that mean for kind of CODAN? It's definitely we are focused on developing that communications piece across the board. We've got obviously a long track record in the comms piece. We have certainly with the last 10 years with Mintec in particular, developed some really interesting technologies in the positioning element around positioning on top of comms, and it's not dissimilar to the work Coda Wireless have been doing in the same kind of time frame. And then when we start taking comms and positioning, you start thinking, what is that value proposition? Well, it's really around situational awareness. Situational awareness for what? Well, we start looking at our markets, first responders, military, etc., and we're putting that lens of situational awareness, tactical situational awareness, to make better decisions. So that's the focus of our work with 11.2, looking at a range of technologies, definitely AI, ML, automation, edge computing, all of those on top of our core technologies to figure out, again, not what could we do, what should we do in that space.
And I think there's a sort of the model that we're establishing, Chris, is that as we ideate and collaborate around their problem space, we start to understand what their real problems are. And if we then see something in the marketplace, like whether it's established company or emerging company that starts to address that problem, we can make that connection. So, success for us in terms of startup world means that we remove the friction from startups engaging with larger companies where there's a match. So I think that...
Maybe, and you've just reminded me of a great example, and it's one where I made a mistake, which is more regular than I'd like it to be. Before we got working with 11.2, I'd been talking to the board about these issues, talking to them about situational awareness, saying to them, this is the direction we need to be going. And the example I always came up with, the one that made perfect sense in my head, was we had the ability to combine communications with non-GPS based tracking. With a few of the technologies, if we're tracking over a shorter distance, it made the problem technically easier. And so the obvious problem for us to go and solve was tracking of firefighters in a burning building, because they've got a 20-minute rebreather time on their oxygen. It's a relatively constrained environment, and you're sending people into harm's way where they might die. So knowing where they are, I think, is really valuable. And for me, that just made perfect sense. And I spoke to the board for about 2 years about producing a system for situational awareness for firefighters in burning buildings. Talk to these guys. They killed it in, 5.5 weeks?
Yeah, we looked into it and we thought... But I think it points to sort of the mindset that we have around this model for innovation, entrepreneurial innovation for larger... We've got to say no, right? And that's the lens of, as a founder, would we have pursued that with a limited amount of money? No, we wouldn't. And I still think that idea is... that problem will probably get solved sometime a long way into the future, but there's just too much to be done to solve it now.
Yeah. And the feedback from George was, yeah, great idea, but if you give the fireys more money, they want to buy more helmets. And if you're asking them about what problem to solve from a positioning perspective in a burning building, just tell them what floor to point the hose. That's it. Job done.
So I think there's a really good example of it's a great problem. It's a good idea to solve, but practically in the environment, it's not going to be solved at the moment.
Yeah. And it's not, and I think we can solve it. It's not going to be bought.
Correct. Yeah. No one
and
will
we
buy
can
it.
certainly spend several $1 million trying to solve it. That I do know.
Question over here.
Yeah. Hey, so the question is around patent strategy and how you lost a bit of time with your problems with China. So at the moment, I've got a startup, and basically the question is, I'm trying to talk about how my software works, my interface works with California. They're under NDA, but they are asking questions that are far too in depth than what you would be able to say. If I was able to have the conversation and look in the eye here, I'd be able to, get a feel for it and figure out what I want to do and how much I want to tell. But they're asking a whole lot of questions, and I don't know how to answer them without going too far. What's your advice to a startup with that problem?
I think you've got to understand where your value lies. And if you've got some secret sauce, be really, really clear in your own mind what that is. And you can talk to Paul beside you, because he has faced that problem, I think, a number of times. But I think if you can clearly identify what it is, you've got to figure out a way and have an open conversation with them that say, listen, that's the secret sauce, that's what my business is based upon. I can't share that with you, but I can wrap a black box around this bit and I can show you this.
Are they investor conversations or partnership investor conversations? Yeah.
It's a difficult one.
No perfect answer to that question.
Unless you trust them implicitly, if you share it, you can't unshare it. Do you trust anyone implicitly?
Well, you need more than an NDA. You need an IP transfer agreement or something so that it protects the IP that you disclose. But then you've got to ask the question, can you defend it? If they're big investors, it becomes really difficult. So I think Rory, this is the bit I will share. If you want to know what's in here, you can write a check.
Yeah.
And you got to have that sort of positioning in some of it. If you want to know what that is, you got to write a check.
Right, well, that's been fascinating, and part of the objective of this event is really to build the community. So we might call it now, because we might still have some cold pizza out the back and some more drinks to be consumed. We're going to sneak one last question in. You look so disappointed, Ryan. Let me throw it to you.
One thing was, from the narrative of your long and fairly eventful courtship between the two of you, are there any lessons that kind of startups can take on how to approach enterprises? Because, enterprise sales is really tricky when you're a small upstart business. Is there any kind of lessons that you've learned from this engagement that others might be able to apply when thinking about approaching larger, while yet small in the context of the globe, companies?
Yeah. They're big.
And for me, one of the key lessons is recognizing the difference in tempo. I mean, because if you guys are downstairs and there's three of you and you're huddled, you're spending kind of 21, 22 hours a day thinking and working on it, and it really matters, and it's heart and soul, and it's sweat, blood, and tears. You can go knock on the door of me or my equivalent in an organization, and we are just operating at a different pace. Yeah. That's really, really hard. But if you don't recognize that and accept it and understand you're going to have to do something here to pop up over here and here, because the relationship's not going to be formed, signed, sealed, and delivered in 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks, anything like it, even though it makes perfect sense to you, or maybe definitely because it makes perfect sense to you. So that disconnect in agility, in pace, in speed of response, in thinking, it's really hard, and that's why these different engagements are difficult.
Yeah, and I think I would, through the lens of a startup, particularly if you're selling a product, like the asymmetry of attention and power, right? Like big company, very distracted, really important to me. Like, oh my God, that's the most important thing in my life. I need them. 1% important to him. That's just the facts. Like, you can't change that. And being really transparent and honest and precise and effective with people's time. So it's like you can't make someone move faster than what they can move, but you can explain the pain. You can be really clear about your asks. You can be really precise about the information you provide. So I think the clearer you are with that, and the more vulnerable and honest you are with enterprise sales, so long as they're good people, and they've got to be, but that works with good people. But if it's an early stage customer for you as a startup, if you're not working with good people on the other side, stop and find good people, because it will not work. Then you can move it efficiently. Might not be quicker, but the amount of time and energy you put into it will be less.
And I think it is really important for you to spend a lot of time thinking about your value proposition.
Yeah.
Because you'll get a 30-second elevator pitch. And if you don't land it, and if it doesn't make sense to the guy on the other side with the right words in his kind of language, his or her kind of language, it's it's something that goes straight by. I'm not interested, kind of too boring. But that bit is really hard because you're quite often talking about complex problems, complex solutions in a complex space, and you've got to nail it in 30 seconds.
Yeah, I read something really good on this. Can't remember where it was, but I read lots of things. And it was, if I've got a product or a service I'm selling to someone, it solves a problem. If I don't understand that problem better than the person I'm selling it to, then I shouldn't be talking to them about it. If I can't articulate their problem and my solution really quickly, like, you're just wasting their time. So it's been really thorough about that problem understanding and that value proposition definition.
It's even been part of the thinking about what's the right model for 11.2, and hence why we're working collaboratively with Stone and Chalk and other organisations. We are deliberately niche in what we do because we want to be part of the ecosystem, and by doing so, we can bring the right organisations together in the right way. And part of our role is not to replicate anything that we don't need to. So if we can better work with these organisations to better define the problem and identify the worthwhile ideas that form part of that, then happy days for the ecosystem, right? And that goes to the essence of what we're trying to build as part of these events, is this community of like-minded people who want to do interesting things with interesting people. So, look, I've got a lot of value out of tonight, not only just bringing this group together, but I've actually sent you a purchase order for 10% of your engineering budget. So if you can, just thank our two guest speakers tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.